โมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. Today I went into town, take part in a Buddhist ceremony, blessing ceremony. And it's quite common for Buddhist blessing ceremonies to begin with somebody, we say they request the 5 precepts. It's a small ritual where the participants in the ceremony, they request the 5 precepts, and a monk or nun gives the precepts as a recitation, line by line. They take the 3 refuges, take refuge in the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, and then undertake to keep the 5 precepts. So when people who are not Buddhist or they're new to this kind of ritual come along, they always ask, well, do we need to say it? Do we need to have this ritual? Well, literally you don't. Keeping of precepts is very much at the foundation of Buddhist practice, because it's learning, you might say, moral discipline, learning, these are like 5 guidelines for keeping you out of trouble, cultivating the intention not to kill, to steal, commit acts of sexual misconduct, not to lie, not to take intoxicants. You're training the intention to refrain from these actions because they tend to those actions will lead us to make negative karma, which will come back on us and disturb the mind, bring us regret, feelings of guilt and remorse, and so on. So you don't necessarily have to go through a ritual and say it out loud, but one thing that it helps with is to make you very mindful of what you're doing. When we speak, say it out loud, you say, I undertake to refrain from killing, for example, the first precept. You become very mindful of that. And you may say, well, I keep the precepts anyway. And if you're very aware of your own mind and the intentions that are coming up through your day, that may be true. But sometimes we break the precepts, sometimes we don't keep them. And making a verbal undertaking can just help re-establish mindfulness and awareness. And Buddhist monks do the same when they come together to hear the recitation of their rules of training every 2 weeks. Then they'll have this little ceremony they call confession of offences, or where you reveal any offences of wrongdoing where you've broken a rule, because we have hundreds of rules of training that we keep or try to keep to train us, our body, speech and mind, to live in a moral way, a harmless way, and so on. You have this ceremony where you sit down with another monk and you open up, you reveal any offence of wrongdoing, if there has been one that you're aware of. And then the other monk says, are you clear that you've broken this rule and you're going to not break it from here on? And you say, yeah, I'm clear, I'm mindful of this, now I'm not going to break this rule again, I'll try not to break it again. You make your determination. And it helps sometimes to say something out loud to a teacher or to a trusted individual. And in the same way for lay people, sometimes we need to say it out loud. Maybe we've broken a precept and we're determined to change our behaviour. So it can help when you say it out loud, either just making the initial taking on of the precepts, or if you've broken the precepts, to re-establish your intention to keep them. So Buddhist ceremonies often have this, undertaking the 5 precepts. And it can be quite useful, develops a certain energy. Everybody has this energy, and at least at that moment everybody is on the same page with the same goal, to use the precepts as a way of training, guidelines, you might say, for skillful living. And literally makes us mindful of what we're doing. Because if you're saying something, then you become mindful of what you're doing when you're saying it, or at least more mindful than just thinking it. And thoughts come and go, and our mood can change very quickly. But when you make a clear determination or resolution to keep a precept, then your level of commitment is a little bit more, isn't it? So it's something Buddhists will do from time to time, take on the 5 precepts, 8 precepts, or if they're ordaining as a monk or a nun, then many more precepts. It doesn't mean to say that straight away you'll be able to keep all the precepts perfectly, of course, because we still are affected by greed, anger, delusion, moments of where we lack clarity, moments when we get caught into anger, greed, lust. There may be moments where we break precepts. But if you get familiar with the undertaking of the precepts, it can be very helpful to focus your mind on what you're doing, and particularly on your external behavior, how you relate to the world, through body, through speech. We used to have a saying in Thailand, if you keep the precepts, or you look after the precepts will look after you. Because if you use the precepts as a guideline every day, then they're like a boundary or a fence that you put around your behavior. And sometimes when you're in an extreme situation, you have a mood come up, anger or some kind of strong desire, greed comes up, some selfishness comes up. You may be tempted to break the precept, but if you've undertaken the precepts, your mind comes to this boundary, to this limit, and it says, oh, this is something that I've undertaken. I'm not going to go beyond this limit or this boundary in my behavior, even though the mind may be saying, I want to do that. I want to kill or hurt somebody, I want to take something that's not mine, and whatever. You have this boundary that you've set up that you're not going to cross. So it becomes a training rule that helps you to be mindful of not only your speech, your actions, but thought as well. What intentions are arising in your mind. Because you now have a guideline to determine whether you're going to behave within the precepts or outside. And you'll notice if, say, you're tempted to break a precept, say you're in your kitchen and there's flies or cockroaches or ants, for example, and you just want to get rid of them, and the easiest way is to get the spray or get the way to kill them, trap them, squash them, whatever. That's the easiest way, and you're tempted to do that. But if you've thought it through previously, and you're giving value to the training of the precepts, and you say, oh, this is not good because this is harbouring the intention to kill, that's coming from a more selfish instinct, coming from aversion, lack of compassion for whatever the living being is that you want to kill. When you've recognised that, and you've recognised the value previously of keeping the precept, the first precept, then when you're in that situation, you're tempted to kill, but you don't because you're using the precept as a way of restraining your action. Then what happens to the intention to kill in that moment? Well, because you're not acting on it, it will have to fade away, won't it? You're not indulging it, you're not reinforcing it. It comes up in your mind, you may be very tempted to squash a fly or a mosquito or whatever it is. But if you've decided to keep a precept, and that's voluntary, no one's making you do that, but if you've decided to keep the precept, then that thought, that intention is going to fade from your mind because of you're not acting on it. So it has no more value to your mind, no more importance in your mind. So it's going to start fading away. Sometimes immediately, sometimes a bit slower. Some intentions are very strong, backed by a lot of powerful emotion, so they may not just fade immediately. But generally they're going to fade because you're not acting on them. So it gives you your first insight into impermanence. You're seeing that the intention to kill arises, passes away. It's impermanent and it's gone. After a while it's gone. Hopefully you didn't act on it, so you didn't make the bad karma of killing. And you also gain some insight, some understanding that such intentions are impermanent and they can be abandoned and let go of. So people often, they say, I go to this ceremony and there was precepts, it's so boring, repetitive. They've heard this ritual of undertaking the 5 precepts so many times, it just puts them to sleep. Okay. There can be that side to it, the repetitive side. But at the same time, if you're using it as a way to train yourself, it can lead straight into vipassana meditation. No different from the practice and training in vipassana meditation, training your mind to see impermanence. What's impermanent is unsatisfactory, it's not self. Seeing a thought, say you have the thought to kill an ant, kill a fly, comes up, but you decided to keep the precept. You don't act on that intention passes away, so you're seeing it as impermanent. You're also seeing it as not self. It's like, if it was self, then there'd always be the thought to kill and you'd probably always act on it. But the very fact that you can see the intention to kill, let it go, let it fade away, not act on it, and then it disappears, is also teaching you not self. And when that intention has disappeared, there'll be a gap in the mind before your next intention, which may be a repeat of the first or something totally different. It just depends on the situation. But you'll be able to, if you're mindful, you'll be able to see that gap, that space. You say, this is a bit of emptiness here, an insight into not self, when that intention to kill fades away because you didn't act on it. And it can give you an insight into how the Buddhist path works, how it gets you from A to B, or A to Z, you might say, from simple undertaking not to kill, to keep the first precept, through to seeing the impermanence and lack of self in intention. And if you keep practicing with the precepts like that, cultivating mindfulness of intention, abandoning the intention that would make you break the precept, cultivating the qualities that you need not to break the precept. So in the case of the first precept, to not act on the intention to kill, you also need to be cultivating kindness, compassion, patience, maybe with a situation where you're provoked to want to hurt or kill. But you're cultivating these wholesome qualities. As you do this, your mind is changing and you're seeing the conditioned nature of your mind and how you can let go of the intention to kill. You can see it as impermanent, as not self. And you're replacing it with something better, the intention to preserve life, respect life, appreciate, value life. And over time you can see how your mind can change for the better. Your negative intentions can be abandoned through not just keeping the precepts, but cultivating mindfulness and insight at the same time. And you see how the precepts support the practice of meditation then. So even though sometimes going to Buddhist ceremonies can, some people find it boring, repetitive, if you look more deeply, it's actually helping us in our practice to bring up more mindfulness and more understanding of what we're doing and why. Also, when you have a lot of people together, sometimes to have a ceremony and to do these sort of things like undertaking the precepts, going for the 3 refuges, listening to Dhamma teaching together as a group, this can bring a sense of calm and purpose to an event where you have lots of people, rather than the more sort of ordinary party atmosphere where everyone is just sort of talking, eating, drinking, whatever. You've got a bit more purpose. So it's a way that you can bring a lot of people together to do something together that is actually conducive to cultivating the path towards the end of suffering. So our practice, we sometimes we have to rely on these things as well as listening to the Dhamma, reflecting on the Dhamma. Sometimes simple rituals can be very valuable for us as an individual or as a group of people. It's the same with, say, offerings. Sometimes people feel awkward or uncomfortable with ceremonies where you're making an offering or a donation to Sangha, perhaps. Maybe there are words recited as people offer Sangha dana or any other kind of dana. Sometimes we offer dana for a funeral when somebody's passed away, offer robes. We have merit-making ceremonies like katinas, papas. Sometimes people, they come together to offer a Buddhist statue or a building that they funded or something. In these occasions, there's a bit of ritual involved, but it can be quite useful even in a meditative way to support mindfulness, because it's making you very mindful of what you're doing at that moment. Even just a ritual offering of food or something else. If you do it, you pause and you take a moment, maybe you recite something, you do it in a sort of formal way, whether you're on your own or you're with many people, it can make it much more meaningful to you, what you're doing. It helps you to be more mindful in that moment. And you'll probably remember it better the more mindful you are in the moment. So even just what you might call simple dana offerings, donations, and so on, if done with mindfulness in a respectful, in a mindful way, it can be a very valuable part of our practice as well. Meditation is the same. Say in a monastery, often you'll chant before you meditate. Sometimes at home you do some chanting, you bow to the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, you chant before you meditate. And these kind of rituals, often they help to cut through the moods of the world that we bring with us. So if you say you've been asleep all night, you wake up in the morning and you want to set your mind straight for the rest of the day, well, you might get up and bow to Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, recite a verse or chant something, and then meditate a bit before you go off and do other things. And the same in reverse. At the end of the day, after having worked for a whole day and being tired and distracted, well, maybe it can help you to settle down. When you come in, you bow to the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, you chant or recite some verses and then do some meditation. So all these small rituals, offering of dana, keeping precepts, even beginning meditation, chanting, they all can have a role to play in our practice, whether we're at home, in the monastery or wherever. partly because it's just making you more mindful that you are practicing the Dhamma. And practicing the Dhamma is training of body, speech and mind, or action, speech and mind. And our mind goes with us wherever we go. It's something we're always forgetting. People always tend to think that Dhamma practice is something you do in a special place, like a monastery, a temple, a retreat center. But the place of practice is your mind. This fathom-long body, however tall you are, whether you're 5 foot tall or 6 foot tall, it's this body is your place of practice. The place of practice is not out there, some special place where you go to. It can be very helpful to go to a monastery or a retreat center, where you learn many things and put effort into your practice, of course, but we really have to grow in our practice and understand that wherever you are, we're cultivating sila, samadhi, panya, or sati panya, mindfulness and insight, wherever we go, wherever we are. Like the practice of mindfulness, cultivating mindfulness is something you can do in any posture, any time. It's really not limited. And just sometimes it's useful to sit down and think, what are the situations where I'm least mindful in my life? Maybe it's around certain activities, like anything sensual that stimulates your senses, so food, sexual relations, entertainments, games, sports, music. All these things tend to make us least mindful. And that's why yesterday we were walking, we had to go through a shopping mall, and there was music everywhere blasting out, and there's a lot of screens with different images on and posters and pictures and so on. But particularly the music, you see how music is associated with retail, with selling you things, whether it's food or other items, because it relaxes you to the point where you're off guard. And you probably remember that simile of the person walking through the marketplace with a bowl filled with oil, and they've got to walk through the marketplace and not spill a drop of oil because they've got a soldier behind them walking along, and they're going to chop off their head with the sword if they drop one drop of oil from this bowl of oil they're holding as they walk through the marketplace. It's a simile of how much mindfulness you need. And then, of course, in the marketplace there's a stage with a beautiful woman dancing and singing there to attract everyone's attention, and you're not allowed to look at her either because you might drop your oil. So it's the most challenging kind of situation, but you've still got to be mindful. Life is like that, isn't it? There'll be many situations where you're tempted to not be mindful. Whether it's entertainments, falling asleep is one, isn't it? When people, their more extreme emotions often come up when they're falling asleep at night. Either they're lying there worrying about things, keeps you awake, or anger keeps you awake. If you've been really angry with someone and you just keep thinking about it, you won't be able to sleep. Maybe if you're really angry, you'll go to sleep for a few hours, you wake up in the morning, your anger is still there. It's so extreme. If you fall in love or lustful thoughts are the same, keep you awake at night. So our strongest emotions will keep us awake at night. That's a time we're often not that mindful. When we're caught into entertainments and situations of indulgence, we're often not that mindful. When we're ill, we're often not very mindful. You notice when you fall ill and you're physically tired, worn out, maybe have pain as well, often the mind finds it very difficult to concentrate, very difficult to meditate, very difficult to separate the mind from the painful feelings of the body. So think it through. These times where you're at least mindful, these are the challenges, how to practice the Dhamma in these situations. And keeping the precepts will be one way that supports you, keeping the precepts whatever. So whether you're ill, you're in a busy situation, you're in a distracting situation, you're tempted through anger, through greed, selfishness, delusion, you're going to keep your precepts. And that will keep you mindful. People are always asking, Ajahn, how do you practice mindfulness in daily life? Keeping the 5 precepts is the way you begin training in mindfulness in daily life. Being mindful, aware of what you're saying, what you're doing, and reflecting through your day whether your actions and speech are within the guidelines of the 5 precepts. It's no different from a Buddhist monk. You might think, a Buddhist monk has a very refined state of mind, deep samadhi, deep insight, but maybe they're also reflecting on the arising of the intention to break precepts. Because that's a big part of our practice, recognizing unwholesome, unskillful intentions that lead on to speech and action, and having enough restraint, mindfulness, not to indulge those intentions. I remember once talking to a nun at Ajahn Chah's monastery, and she was saying, I was asking her how she was doing. She said, I'm getting older. She was about 60. She says, as you get older, the practice in some respects gets a bit easier. Some of the fires of anger and greed and lust die down. Some things get harder because your body is more aches and pains, more illness. But some things get better because you're more experienced with letting go. She said when she was a young nun, first ordained, she had so much lust, she'd be rolling around in her hut in the forest, trying to restrain herself. But over the years, practicing letting go, it's got to the point where it doesn't bother her so much because she's seen through it, seen it as impermanent, not self, seen the unattractiveness of the body. That's what training with precepts does. Over time, you become much more mindful. Your wisdom, your insight becomes much more refined. So the fires of greed, anger, and delusion burn less and less in your mind. Your behavior becomes more restrained, and this is how the precepts look after you, by practicing with them. Of course, at first, it's hard work keeping precepts. You're angry, so you want to speak out and display your anger, say things, do things. But if you keep working at it, it gets much easier to let go of anger. It becomes more automatic over time. That's the value of practicing mindfulness with the precepts and then contemplating the impermanence of those impulses, those intentions that lead you to break the precepts. I know many people who said when they began practicing Buddhist meditation and then started taking an interest keeping precepts, when they first practiced, when they get angry, they would throw things and break things, break plates and smash things down and do all kinds of unskillful things, and of course say things as well. But over the years, they've learned to give all that behavior up. And they've calmed down, right down. So, they still have anger arise, but they just see it as a mood now. Now they can see the mind, see the mood, separate the mind, the mood, and let it go. Before there was no restraint, no mindfulness. But that's the result of the precepts, is that over time they become much more gentle with themselves, more mindful, the mind becomes more refined, and those sort of coarse mind states of greed, anger and delusion, they can see them and let them go. Anyone who lives in a monastery over time will learn to not kill. You may have, when you first come into a monastery, if you get bothered by insects, you may have that initial impulse to swat them. But just quite naturally over time, the intention to kill drops away from your mind, so it doesn't even arise. And this is part of the practice, just learning to see these negative intentions as impermanent, not self, and letting them go to the point where they just don't arise anymore. you could say this is the conditioning process. Seeing things as not self means also seeing they're just things, mental states that arise due to causes and conditions. But as you practice the Dhamma, this is a new set of causes and conditions. So gradually, those negative intentions don't arise anymore. Or if they arise, it's very briefly, and straight away you let them go through practice. Once you understand how the precepts are supporting your development of insight, mindfulness and insight, then you have no argument with them. In the beginning you argue with the precepts. You say, I want to do this. I want to say what's on my mind. I want to do that. I want to squash the fly. I want to take the thing that doesn't belong to me. I want to get drunk. I want to do this. I want to do that. Of course, your mind will argue with the precepts. But over time, hopefully by reflecting, you see the value of them. And then it's the opposite. Your mind wants to keep the precepts, and you will argue with someone else who may try to encourage you not to keep the precepts. You start looking after the precepts, as say, like a yak looks after its fur coat. For those of you who don't know what a yak is, it's that kind of furry, cow-like creature that lives in the Himalayas. It's got really long fur, a hairy, furry coat, and it needs it to keep warm because it's so cold up in the mountains. And that yak doesn't want to lose a single hair because this is what keeps it alive during the winter. So if it gets caught on some brambles or some tree branches or something, it doesn't want to just pull away and let its fur, its hair be damaged. It'll try its best to preserve its hair because it's its life. That's what protects it from the cold. In the same way, one who sees the value of the precepts over time, they don't want to break a single precept for whatever reason. They say even on pain of death, if it's a sotapanna, stream winner, they just give up thinking of killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, abusive speech, getting drunk. They just completely give up any intention to do that, and they just wouldn't, even if you force them, they wouldn't do it. It just doesn't arise in their mind. The mind changes. The view of the world changes. So for the Sotapanna, they say, this right view is established. It just becomes normal. So wherever they are, whether they are ill or falling asleep or in a very difficult situation where they're being provoked or tempted in some way, they don't want to lose their precepts because they know that would be following the way of unwholesome intentions, making more bad karma, taking them further away from Nibbana. So they don't want to go backwards anymore. They say for the stream winner, there's no more chance of being reborn in a lower realm. So there's an animal, a ghost realm or hell realm. They say even on pain of death, so even if they've been attacked or bullied, or even if someone was very seductive in some way, or there's just whatever the temptation, the intentions are changed and the right view is established. People used to ask Ajahn Chah, what's our aim in practice when we're new to the Dhamma practice? What's our main aim? He said, establish right view, samma ditthi. With right view, you understand what is wholesome karma, what is unwholesome. You understand the value of precepts. You don't want to break them anymore. You don't want to follow the way of unwholesome karma. You may still have unwholesome mental states and intentions arise in the mind, but because you've established right view, you naturally will be abandoning them, and quickly. You don't want them to sit in your mind. It's like, it's like fire. If you see a fire, you quickly put it out. A fire in your house or somewhere, you would just quickly put it out. You wouldn't let it burn because you know it will burn your house down. You won't, as a Sotapanna, they don't let their unwholesome intentions sit in their mind because it'll burn the whole mind down. It'll ruin the whole practice, ruin the whole life. So Ajahn Chah said, get that established, get the right view established where you see the value of keeping precepts, letting go of unwholesome mental states and cultivating wholesome states, and you have no doubts about that anymore. It just becomes natural for you. And if you do that regularly, well, you might notice long periods of time go by where you don't have a single intention to kill, steal, commit acts of sexual misconduct, lie, or get drunk. You just don't have the intention arise for long periods. Perhaps if the situation is right, it may still return. Who knows? You never know. But if you notice for long periods those intentions don't arise, then you are really becoming established in the Buddhist path. That's our aim. And we can all do that. We can all aspire to that. So often you hear people aspire to attaining jhana, and attaining to stages of insight. Another way of looking at the practice is just attaining to right view, establishing right view, seeing the value of precepts, keeping to them to the point where those intentions to break the precepts no longer arise. There may still be greed, anger and delusion present in the mind, some lust, some aversion, because, say, a stream enterer, a stream winner, they still have some attachment to the body, some identification with the body, but the view has changed, so they no longer indulge or harbour unwholesome mental states. If unwholesome mental states arise, they work as quickly as they can to abandon them. There's no doubt about that. And that's something we can all aspire to. Aspire to establishing right view, keeping the precepts. If you keep reflecting on the Buddha, who the Buddha was, the Dhamma and the Sangha, the noble ones, you'll get the strength of mind to do this. Of course, if you keep forgetting the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, then who knows where you'll get your inspiration from. It'll be difficult. And that's the trouble nowadays with information technology and all the different distractions there are in the world. It's so easy for the mind just to go out to the world and forget the Dhamma, forget the Buddha. And then your mind is back on shaky ground. You get caught into doubt, you get uncertainty, you're not clear what is wholesome karma, unwholesome karma, lose track of the path. Another factor, they say, if you want to practice Dhamma in daily life, practice the precepts, mindfulness, well, listen to Dhamma regularly, because we forget it. We forget what the Buddha taught. We forget the words of the Buddha. We lose our way, lose our direction. So regularly coming back to listen to the Dhamma and respecting the Dhamma. If you give it respect, give it value, then your values will change over time. By listening to the Dhamma, you'll value the qualities of mindfulness, compassion, wisdom, patience, all the different useful, skillful qualities that we are cultivating through the practice. Those will be what you aspire to and give value to, whether you see them in yourself or in other people. And the qualities that lead us away from the Dhamma, the selfishness, the greed, the aversion, the hatred, the intolerance, the impatience, the delusion, the confusion, the intoxication with the world, those kind of qualities you'll give less value to, less importance to. So naturally they'll come up less and less in your psyche, in your mind. So the Buddhist path is there for us to practice, and sometimes these simple rituals, reminders, whether it's a ritual, whether it's a Dhamma talk, taking the precepts, whatever they are, they can be very helpful for just steering us along the path. And if you keep on the right path with right view, then keeps you out of suffering more and more, and you'll only aspire more and more to keep practicing for the end of suffering. Maybe for now I'll just leave the talk there, and if anyone has any questions, we can go into them after this.